Hello, fellow armchair generals, historians, wargamers. This, of course, is Gamer 1745 here, and I'm making a special video right now. I think many people may be interested in this. This is, but specifically for Nick Gould, sort of a ghoulish name there, but just had to do that. I just read the first 2.5 questions or so, and he's got a long one. And I really appreciate the interest. I really appreciate people value my opinions on things, dealing with World War II and history and such. But I want to tell you one thing up now. I'm a slow typer. I hate typing. So that's why I'm making a video. I love talking. It's not that I don't want to communicate. So I didn't want to just do, though I do appreciate it, it is in, numbered. That is a very good way to get questions answered, because you could go yes, no, maybe, or something quick answers there. But I thought, well, okay, first couple of questions were good, and could deserve answering, and we will go to it. So, bit off topic, but you were the first person to come to mind in terms of educational, neutral, and logical historian warfare. Hobbyist questions are actually series what ifs or ors, basically outcome of World War II if Germany through some god hand made a decision listed below, likely outcome, and correct me if my takes were unbeknowingly incorrect. Okay, interesting though, God hand. Hitler definitely believed in a higher power, and that higher power was guiding him. And this, I think, it is an evolving viewpoint that Hitler had. If you look at Hitler, contradicts himself. And people often find, well, he supported this or he supported that. Well, sometimes he's just, when campaigning, he goes and talks in front of a bunch of people in a church. He's going to say whether Catholic or Protestant things, or he goes in front of an atheist audience, he's going to contradict himself. So some of it is just pre-internet, not people hearing all, everything you say and contradicting yourself. So some of it is just, election campaigning. But if you look at Hitler's life, you look at all of, particularly he does the near misses of assassination attempts and other things in his life, including, political and military events. He definitely believes that there's some, not God in the, at least I would not say God in the sort of Judeo-Christian sense, but some sort of higher power is guiding him. And this, this is why he's demented at the end. Hitler has a lot of weird takes, but, evil ones. But it's only at the very end as he is detached, in my opinion, from reality. He is living in a half-dream world kind of thing at the very end. Up until there, he has, again, mystical views and other things that may not be rational, but he understands rationally the world, and he's just evil. Okay, get that out of the way. I just thought that was interesting. Okay, question 1. What would have occurred if the order was given to attack the encirclement and take the British as POWs if it had succeeded? What would have been the effect on Britain? Okay, I'm going to presume that this is Dunkirk kind of thing. Okay. One element you have to remember is, and I say this a lot, warfare is a political act. Politics are perceptions, okay? So just the perceptions of things, if held by a large group of people, are true. Was Dunkirk a defeat? Well, of course it was. But it was also a victory in that they saved, the British soldiers, some light equipment, rifles and that kind of stuff, but even a lot of that was lost. So it's spun as a victory, bringing a victory out of the jaws of defeat kind of thing, or whatever. So it's spun as that, as a victory. So it is perceived as a victory by the British, and it's perceived as a victory by the Germans because they defeat France, they defeat the British Army flees. So it's perceived on both sides, the situation, as a victory in a way. I would say the biggest change we would see, because I think Churchill had a strong enough mental fortitude and was captivating the British people enough to keep them from giving up. I think the biggest effect would be in North Africa. It would have meant a weakening, because it takes a while, but the Italians are doing so poorly early on in North Africa. Their first attack into Egypt, some have described it as sort of Napoleonic tactics and marching and whatnot, and a very inferior British force defeats, in numbers at least, maybe it's superior in other ways, but defeats a much larger, apparently more well-equipped, though equipped with Italian equipment, Italian force, and sort of very piecemeal way, but very quickly rolls it up, and that's a disaster for the Italians in the opening days of North Africa. I don't know if it would have been enough of an effect to cause a defeat in Egypt, but maybe. And if that's the only thing that happens in Egypt, Germany still loses the war. It just may take longer. Just my appreciation. 2, if the Austrian man didn't make the impulsive order to focus the Luftwaffe on terror bombing instead of Air Force installments and war industry, would it have yielded success? What would have been the outcome? Okay. Well, my understanding is the RAF was near defeat at the time of switching over from the Battle of Britain, as Nick is talking about here, as focusing not so much on war industry, but in defeating the RAF to then allow for a sea lion, a German invasion of Britain. The Germans did not understand how well the radar and centralized command was doing to focus the RAF on any incoming attacks. They were thinking that they were, and the British did publicize, especially internally, and I'm sure the Germans noticed this, their spotting command and the whole system of early warnings and sending, telephoning in aircraft and whatnot, locations. And that wasn't just propaganda to have them do that, because early radar, you're not getting necessarily, and I don't know exactly what all the screens look like, but it really isn't so much like you're seeing a bunch of individual aircraft. You're seeing like maybe a group of aircraft as a fuzzy blob coming over, and the spotters would identify them, give numbers if they could, depending on the weather and whatnot. And of course, it gives the excuse for everybody that is what is vectoring in the RAF fighters. And my understanding is that the Germans, they knew about radar. Obviously, they were working on it themselves, but they didn't quite understand how effective it was being used. And they weren't concentrating their attacks on radar towers. I think they did a bit, but they had been attacking, as Nick is suggesting here, Air Force, the RAF installations, bases, but the British had already dispersed the airfields around to literal farm fields, the drier ones that weren't soggy and whatever. So these didn't lend them well to detail or significant maintenance of the aircraft, pulling an engine apart and working on it that way. It was sort of the basic basic maintenance on it, but it did disperse and hide where, because I don't think the Luftwaffe had any real good notion where each squadron was sort of plunked around in the southeast of Britain, but they knew where the big air bases were, and I don't think the German invasion would have been successful. They waited too long, and they couldn't have done. They weren't prepared when France fell, because France falling shocked the Germans as almost as much as it shocked the French. It was a positive shock, but so they were totally unprepared for the idea of, oh yeah, next week or even next month, in 30 days we're going across that channel. They were unprepared for that. By the time the Germans were potentially prepared, you still had intact, to a degree, the RAF Bomber Command and Coastal Command, because that is not where the lot of the damage was being done. And when Admiral Jarvis was asked in, I'm not sure exactly the year, but probably around 1805 or something, during one of the, because that's I'm just using that year because that's the year of the Battle of Trafalgar, but one of the invasion scares that the French were going to be invading Britain during the Napoleonic Wars. He was social event, a ball. He was asked by a prominent person, how were the French going to be in invading Britain, and he said very honestly, I don't know how the French are going to invade Britain, but they sure aren't going to be coming by sea. Meaning he wasn't going to let it happen, and the Royal Navy was going to sink any French invasion force. So, balloons existed then, not enough to balloon over the French Napoleon's army, and they probably weren't going to tunnel under the channel. So basically, he was saying they weren't going to invade. I think the Royal Navy would have come down and damaged whatever invasion fleet well enough, significantly enough, even if that meant the Royal Navy was going to be on the bottom of the sea, so that the Germans, whatever does get ashore, wouldn't be enough to successfully take over Britain. That's my estimation of the Royal Navy. Now, on wartime industry, Britain was dispersing its industry. Britain, all it really had to do was hold on. Churchill was a historian. He wrote, a 4-volume history of the English-speaking peoples. Got it over on my shelf. As well as a very good biography of one of his ancestors, the Duke of Marlborough. That would be John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, and other works. So he was a historian and of the Napoleonic era. So he knew Britain just had to hold on, and so long as it did so, it was going to survive, in his eyes, at least. Yeah, I don't see the Germans successfully invading. And other than defeating the RAF more so that it doesn't bomb Germany so much, yeah, that would probably be better for Germany, that is. Destroy more of the wartime industry. Yeah, that would probably be better for the Germans too, but I don't know how effective it was going to be, because you can look at some of the spy chronicles and some of the turned agents that were over there that, in one case, the agent needed to, he was getting a lot of pressure. So he went and he reported that he set up an explosive device at a munitions factory. this was all pre-planned, and they did fake bomb damage over it, and the agent sort of had to tell them, where the factory was, and they flew over reconnaissance aircraft. Yep, there's a bunch of damage there. Went home. Yep. So agent still good agent when he had already been turned and was in British service. So I don't know how well and how effective German technology would have been on destroying Britain's war industries as opposed to just bombing the cities, because we can look at how Britain did not feel it could bomb Germany's a factory, and so it did area bombing in areas where there was heavy industry to destroy the factories, yes, but not specifically targeting the factories like the Americans attempted to do and ultimately failed to do. And towards the later war, was it under Hap Arnold or forget who, the Americans go to daylight area bombing because the Norton bomb site isn't quite as good as it's advertised. I forget who, another YouTuber's deep dive on it just a few days ago, and it was really good. Part of it was, I know and long talked about, where it was tested in the American Southwest, it was very clear. In Europe, the weather isn't so clear, but also the altitudes that the Americans ended up bombing at was much higher than originally envisioned and tested for the Norton bomb site. And there was another bomb site that was probably better than, was, according to the video, was better than Norton's, but Norton, the guy running the Norton company, did a lot of marketing to the government. I mean, it was all secret, or a lot of it was secret until the war started. But in leading up to it, really got his name out there. I think it's a good bomb site. It just isn't that good of a bomb site, but a few things. So, and that's one of the more sophisticated ones out there. And yeah, I don't know that targeting wartime industry versus just targeting cities is going to be a whole lot better for Germany. Okay. Number 3. I hope this is all interesting. If it is, if you're new here, of course, hit the subscribe button, but everybody out there can hit that like button and post your comments. If they're thoughtful enough, and I can't just answer in a few words, I may make another video, especially if this is popular. Could have Franco Spain been somehow coerced into joining the Axis, even by force of military threat? Aware of Spanish defecting once serious Allied forces had least military access to Gibraltar, give it insulates the former. What would have been the logistical repercussions of Britain in the North African theater, and by extension Operation Torch? If it does occur in this timeline, what would have been the overall effect on Britain, and what would have occurred on the front? Okay. Well, I'll just basically, and we'll talk about some of my thoughts on how they come in. I think it was better for Germany that Franco Spain never comes in, and it would have been best for Germany if Italy never entered the war, but had been somewhat like Franco's, a friendly neutral, a nation that was openly or covertly, if it's military supplies, trading with Germany, because Spain was making pistols, the Astra pistols, and selling large batches of them to the German military, and sending all kinds of resources into Germany, whatever it could. Had Italy been doing the same thing and been just too much for particularly the British, but even maybe the Americans, to actually declare war on them, that would have secured much of Hitler's southern front and kept the Balkans at relative peace. You still might get somebody like Hungary and Romania involved, as threats from the Soviet Union would make them move to a German alliance. But Yugoslavia, Greece, Italy at peace, that would have helped Germany a lot. Okay, so let's just say Spain comes into the war. It would have basically changed nothing logistically for the North African theater. Um, Basically, all of the supplies are once Italy is significantly in the war, all supplies are going around Africa. So nothing changes there. There is one critical convoy that comes in from the west, out through that part way has an aircraft carrier. I think it was the Ark Royal and some other ships that were escorting it. But at some point, the bulk of the escort turns around and heads out because they can't quite risk it. Though the aircraft from the aircraft carrier are providing aerial cover as long as they can and still make it back. And it's like one of the tankers comes in to the port, and like it's a tanker full of fuel. Well, the bow is blown off or whatever, and it's barely afloat. More that it's almost that it's gasoline is less dense than water, and it just barely. But they're able to get it into port from all the attacks finally, and pump all the fuel out of it, and mainly that was going to fuel the few fighters and whatnot that were defending the Malta. So it probably would have meant the collapse of Malta. Probably would have collapsed Malta. Now, if Spain is in the war at the time America enters the war, I don't see them doing I don't know what they would do. You can't effectively don't even worry about Gibraltar, because I think a large Anglo-British fleet could just go right through there with enough cover and land. The problem is logistically, whether you're holding Gibraltar or not, that doesn't really matter. It just air bases, Cadiz and other southern Spanish regions just being used, whether by Spanish or presumably German and Italian aircraft, that you really can't logistically move into the Mediterranean. I am a proponent of the idea that if you could have closed off the Mediterranean, Germany, etc., has a chance at winning. But Spain is not the factor, in my opinion, on closing that off. Had they closed, you also have to close off Egypt too, and you have to effectively control North Africa, not have it as Vichy territory. I think it would have, quite likely they would have done a torch landing in Morocco still, because I'm going to presume one thing that isn't talked here is yes, you could coerce theoretically Spain in, but one of the big things Spain was asking for was Morocco, to be turned over to it as one of, because there was a military threat, because then there was one, maybe not terribly serious, but Franco doesn't know how serious it is. In essence, Franco does not want to go to war. I respect Franco for what he does. I know a lot of people hate Franco. Partially that comes from the less propagandizing against him. Yes, he was a dictator. We can go into a lot of the stuff, but I think he stabilizes Spain, keeps Spain out of the war, sets up a successor situation in which the king comes back in and to set up a stable democracy, not a democracy that will be taken over either by the right or the left, which is what had the left had taken over and was spiraling it towards a people's democracy of radical leftism. He wanted a stable Spain. Now he has Franco's never been a fascist. He's a nationalist. There are fascists within Franco's government, Yeah, Franco does bad things, but if you look at the times he lives in, bad things are happening. So, FDR does bad things. We can look at interning Japanese Americans, not just Japanese residing in America, which you naturally do round up all foreign nationals, whether you send them home or whether you put them in camps. That is the normal thing. That's what everybody does when a war breaks out. Britain rounds up all of the Germans. They go through them. Oh, you guys are Jewish. You're obviously anti-Hitler. Oh, you over here are known to be an anti-Hitlerite. Okay, yeah, you can go free. They go through all of the Germans that are living in Britain at the time and sort through them and determine who they need to keep in camps and who they, who want to help them out and those in between, kind of thing. So we can look that all nations are doing bad things. So Franco is not the best, but Franco keeps Spain out of the war. So Franco wants to say no, but he knows saying no can have a bad repercussions on Spain. So Franco says, yes, we'll join your Axis and your war. Sounds fun. Here's all of my requirements. Gives a list that he believes that Hitler can't or won't, but some of it is can't, maybe because it's supplying a certain amount of food, because Spain has been wrecked by a civil war and needs food, and needs to get more agricultural going, and all of that going on, and Germany is needing food, so Germany can't supply more food to Spain. So he gives a yes, just so long as you do this stuff, then we're good, guys, but let's just say he decided he wanted to go into the war because, I don't know, fearing communism or whatever. I don't know. I think the Western Allies would have secured Morocco. I do not believe Spanish occupation of Morocco would have been too much more significantly strong than French Vichy occupation, though the soldiers may have been more willing to fight than the Vichy soldiers were briefly fighting, but not very hard, not very long. That would have probably stalled out at securing Morocco, which would then, I think, quite possibly, especially with the war raging in the Soviet Union, the war raging over in Egypt, presumably Germans, and because there's very little connection between Morocco and Algeria, it is an area that the Americans, I think, logistically with the motorization and whatnot, could jump over the harsh environment and get into Algeria, but I don't think they can continue to support huge amounts of forces on the far side of that, and I'm still taking the Mediterranean as being too dangerous to ship in too many forces or supplies that way. And I don't think the German, Italian, whatever, are going to logistically be able to do the opposite. I just don't, considering that they have everything else going on. If it was just, hey, we're just fighting a war in Morocco, they could probably do it too, but with everything else going on, no, I don't think they could. So I think that could become a secure base for the Americans, which probably would have meant a second front in Europe, but in Spain. That is where I would see something happening. I think it very well could collapse Franco's regime. Salazar, I don't know if we're going to get to it. I haven't read beyond the question 3 here, so we're going to go down. I know this is turning out to be a long video, but I hope interesting. Salazar is also a nationalist. His Nuevo Party, his new party, is a nationalist party. It is not a fascist party, and we have been so propagandized going back to the time period by socialists and communists calling every right-wing organization fascist, when some of them aren't fascist. Some of them are just, have you know, they're authoritarian parties. Definitely, they're not necessarily democratic or whatever parties. And people use the term democratic differently, and it's a whole nother topic. And what two people saying democratic are meaning two different things. But where the Novo Party, which existed at the same time in Brazil, was a fascist party. Same name, different party, different group of people running it in Brazil than Salazar. Salazar, actually, I think it's in 37 or so, 1937, writes after one of the Nuremberg laws, writes an anti-Hitler, anti-Nazi, and publishes a book that he personally writes. I don't know, he may very well have a ghostwriter or editor or whatever, but he publishes an anti-Hitler book. That's not only does he not just want war in the Iberian Peninsula, and he wants it peace. Yeah, he's a right-winger. Yeah, he's an authoritarian. Yes, to those two things for sure. But he's a practical, as opposed. See, this is the big thing is between like Franco and Salazar. They're practical men, not ideological like Mussolini or Hitler. So they look for practical solutions, which sometimes might have elements of fascism, but elements of fascism comes out of socialism, so elements of fascism are socialist. So these different parties and ideologies share some similarities on the right and the left. It's not just right or left or whatever. So he does not like Hitler. He allows a military invasion of the Azores Islands by the United States, does not complain. Yes, his people continue to run the local administration, but the Americans get to set up some bases and base smaller boats and ships out of there, and a land-based anti-submarine aircraft out of the Azores to shut down the U-boats, and he doesn't really complain much. And nobody, even Franco, doesn't, it's not an issue. So he is, generally speaking, pro-Britain, so long as Britain is not supporting radical leftists like they were in the Spanish Civil War. So long as, Britain is, not supporting the radical left, he is pro-Britain, anti-Hitler, not, again, he's not ideologically a fascist and wanting to implement fascism, but he is an authoritarian. An authoritarian might very well allow personal liberties, so you can go do what you want within, certain bounds. Just you don't get to vote for, an opposition party. You just get to live under what the government decides to do, but otherwise you can have personal liberty. And I don't know the details of that, but so he's not one of these, Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin types. He's more of just, hey, let's not have chaos in my country, and let's try to run it on a practical basis, and we don't need elections, kind of thing. Is how I understand Salazar. So that very well could be a friendly base of operations that would allow a friendly invasion, friendly military invasion of the Americans and the British, to then push into Spain. The Americans could bomb on the Pyrenees, the main two ways between, since going back forever, the main two ways across are the two coastal ends. They could be bombing those to disrupt supplies into Germany, and we could see a repeat of the Peninsula Wars under Wellington during the Napoleonic era. We could see that going in Spain, and the Americans and the British fighting in that sort of war, instead of what we see in Italy after North Africa. See them securing a good chunk of at least the southern 2/3 of Spain, and then pushing the rest of North Africa out, and then into Italy and everything else. So it very well could be a delay, but it might actually drain resources, because instead of sending the Africa Corps or the later Armée of Africa, after the Americans come into Tunisia, instead of just those limited amount of forces, you may need to send 3 or 4 or 5 times as many forces into Spain, which would be a further drain on the Eastern Front, kind of thing. So it can be making it even worse and a quicker downfall of Hitler than what was historically. So it might actually backfire. Okay. Okay, what if the Germans sent a single infantry division to help the Italians hold Albania instead of spending precious time and resources invading Greece on their behalf? Would this be enough to not risk the Balkans front? How would the affect the first year of operations of Barbarossa? Would it buy enough time for the Germans to reach Moscow or to do some more significant damage to the Red Army? The great debate, the delay into Barbarossa, the encirclements versus pushing for Moscow, and a hard push into Leningrad versus trying to encircle Leningrad. Debates. What ifs. A lot could go in there. The Germans exhaust themselves in the invasion of the Soviet Union. Yes, the calendar is an issue. The first freezes and whatnot are an issue. But I don't know that if they'd gotten there a little earlier and let's just say somehow been able to take Moscow, which is very they'd already mobilized and dug some huge, massive, both as in size as well as sort of, not necessarily ringing Moscow, but sort of, in front of Moscow. Anti-tank ditches and other sort of fortifications, huge, massive effort of mobilizing the populace. Let's just presume that the Germans got into Moscow. The counteroffensive, the Germans might just have been so exhausted because they were, there were, okay, by the time you get to Moscow, a lot of the divisions are tank strength, are down to like 1/4 or 1/3 of the tanks in the division. That does not mean that 2/3 of those tanks have been destroyed. That just simply means 2/3 of those tanks or more of the particular tank division that's made there are not in service. So some, yes, have been knocked out. Some have been damaged and are going to be repaired and put back in. That happens more than people realize. And the tanks are all strung out in service parks, if you will. Park is a term for a place where you park things in the military. It often goes back to the 17th century. They call it like the artillery park. And it's not necessarily a specific location, as in a sign. It's a mobile place. You used to have. Oh, well, we're going to put the artillery park over there today, and then next month we're going to move it over here. It's it's partially a place to park, but it's also to service up them. So the Panzer parks or whatever they would have been called, because they would have had maintenance facilities, but collection points to do maintenance. So a lot of them are just transmissions, engines need work, tracks need replacing. Yes, some combat damage needing repaired. Some of them, yes, catastrophic explosions that you've seen these pictures in which they've cooked off and the turret's blown off and the armor is warped out. Yeah, okay, that's going back to the scrap yard. Maybe if they're in desperate need, they could pull some road wheels or track links or something off of that wreck. But otherwise, the bulk of it's going back in there. But a lot of them are just, something's penetrated the front of the tank, killed enough of the crew, and it's gone into the engine, and it no longer runs. Well, we need a new engine. We need to, you go in, and the Germans could do this. They were had good cutting torches. Cut out that piece of armor, stick in a new piece of armor, weld it right back up. It's a weaker spot, but it works. And stick in a new engine, and zoom, off you go. So tank back in operation. No other major damage. Killed the crew, or enough of the crew, and made it non-driving for a while, so it stopped driving. Now, because of the Russian counteroffensive, as it's called, the Winter counteroffensive, so much of that equipment was lost. So much equipment was lost because everything was frozen, and the Germans, who did have calendars and did understand that things got cold in Russia, trust me, they did understand this, did not make preparations to supply antifreeze to vehicles, and even still, they would need to literally start fires under the engines of the vehicles to warm up the oil enough to be able to literally start the engine. Even with antifreeze in the system, the oil would coagulate would freeze in essence, or just get muddy. It wouldn't be necessarily, I don't know, but like rock hard or anything, but enough that it won't flow and the pistons won't move. And so you've got to heat the engine up. Well, when you're being attacked, you don't have time to do all that, and get it going even if you could. So the Germans lose so much of the equipment. The Soviets make they take a bunch of German Panzer IIIs, pull the turrets off, put on a casemate on there, and stick on a bigger gun to where it's a class of tanks, of 50 or so or whatever they make, and send them out there. And the Germans capture a few of them and improve them and use them back against the Soviets themselves. But they capture so much equipment that's just lost. So a lot of equipment is lost, even when you're getting the divisions trickling back with maybe the great bulk of the personnel. Their equipment's lost. So that's just a catastrophe. And I don't know that would have done anything different. But one thing, again, go back to warfare is a political act. Politics are perception. If Germany looks unstoppable, and if they take Moscow rapidly, maybe whether it's the Stalin government, particularly, or whether it's the Soviet government, generally speaking, may collapse. That's a possibility. And then it all depends on how well Hitler particularly could deal with that fact. Not a military, because it's not a military question at that point. Because if you keep pushing hard, you keep getting the generals to go east, go east, go east. They're confused. They don't know what to do. Well, if they look like there's no other option, we're going to change terms. The Russian people will continue to fight. But if you give your enemy a way to do another Brest-Litovsk treaty, second, third, or the sort of the end of the second third of World War I, where huge amounts of Russia get under at least German administration, you can do something like that and sign a ceasefire of some sort. That would be something of a game changer, but that's a big what if, and that's a political what if, and which warfare is politics, true, but is more of a political situation than a military at that point. Okay, according to all previous factors, what if Germans didn't expose themselves to encirclement by not attacking southern Russia and attempt to consolidate Baku oil fields? Soviets would have destroyed them before. Yes, absolutely. There were plans to destroy the Baku fields. I mean, not just plans. They implemented them in the sense that they had already wired all of the oil industry elements, not just the oil wells themselves, but wired everything up to explode with dynamite or TNT or whatever. So they wouldn't have done that. So the Germans had established a static eastern front defensive line, roughly spanning between, consider a shipping check. Okay, the static defense line is a bad idea. That is a Hitler idea. The Soviets will be able to organize enough in some theater to overwhelm German defenses, okay? And if all you're doing is pouring in more resources to keep that part of the line from collapsing, you're giving the enemy a victory because you're using up your resources badly. Where if you realize where he's coming as it's happening, and you can fall in, let him expand in, and then encircle him and destroy the pocket. The big reason why Operation Citadel failed in going after the cursed pocket was the big delay from making the pocket into the line to then the counterattack, which gave the Soviets the time to fortify and the time to reinforce, because they had been warned that there was a planned counterattack because of I think it's the Enigma codes being broken and whatnot. So they get the warning, so they prepare that. So it would be better to keep a more fluid situation. Going into down to Baku, or cutting off the south, is a good idea. It was executed poorly, in my opinion. Meaning they put in forces, and we may get to it, poured forces into Stalingrad instead of pouring in forces to cut Stalingrad and the whole south off from the rest of Russia to the north. Which could, okay. 5.5. What if the Germans gave Finland enough extra resources, infantry division power to cut off Murmansk? Okay. Not going to change what... the Finns had every capability of going on the offensive against either Leningrad or Murmansk. They had the capability. They could have done it. They could have cut those rail lines. Would have been easy enough. Would have been no problem. Mannerheim refused to have his soldiers leave the previous boundaries of Finland. Oh, hey, Germans, you wanna keep going? Oh, sure, go ahead. Go push into Russia. Have fun storming the castle, guys. I don't know if you get the reference there, but have fun. We're hanging back here, and it's why Finland survives, because they don't leave. They see it as the continuation war of the Soviet invasion of Finland, not a war to conquer the Soviet Union. And so and Stalin is not, politics is perception. Stalin is painting a picture of the unstoppable Soviet army. Stalin knows that if he sends in enough forces to crush Finland, it's going to exhaust his forces even more. And my understanding is by the time they've gotten to Berlin, and I've heard a million men, Soviet men, die in the taking of Berlin. I don't know if that's true, and I think that's Greater Berlin area, but I don't quite know if that's true. But large numbers of Soviet soldiers die in the push into Berlin. I don't know if we'd ever have a good, solid, accounting reference of how many did die. The Soviets are exhausted by that point. They're not capable, in my opinion, at that point, to take on another good, well-equipped army at that point and defeat it. Doesn't mean that, that would have been easy for Operation Unthinkable or whatever to have the Western Allies attack the Soviet Union. No, that's a long ways into the Soviet Union, and there are more forces there, but the Soviets have really scraped the bottom of the manpower barrel by the end of, by 45. And so Finland would just been one more headache on them. So they go for a negotiated peace there. But yeah, the effects would be cutting off Lend-Lease, which would, or some of the Lend-Lease. Eventually, more Lend-Lease is coming in through Iran than is coming through Murmansk. But it would have cut off some Lend-Lease. It would have, if you could have secured Leningrad all the way through to, not necessarily to Archangel, if you know where that is on the map, but all sort of, you go draw a line from Leningrad sort of diagonally to whatever the ocean or the sea is called up sort of that sort of inlet, sea inlet there. cut that area off. You would shorten the front. You would allow the Germans to have. It would be the same kind of effect as taking Stalingrad. So it would have had an effect. Now it is not going to change the outcome of the war, but is going to, if you can do it without causing too much, losses on the German side, and it's really up to the Germans, because you have Dietl up there who's fighting that war in the north. You could just give him more equipment and supplies, but you also need to supply him effectively, and which really is going to mean up through Norway and coastally. You're going to have naval elements, shipping elements to supply, and they did try this a bit, but to supply a sort of leapfrogging along the coast. Because if you can push out across and cut the rail links, but I don't think you can supply a blocking force at Murmansk long enough to hold it and keep holding against the German counterattack. But you can cut it off and retreat and then attack in some other place. It's more of a supply issue, but you can take Murmansk if you just give it enough effort. There was nothing super great about the defense up there. It was nothing. It just the Finns weren't willing to go, and smart of them. Before list 6, I would also like to interject some things I'm aware of. I highly encourage you to correct me if I'm wrong. Thank you. Okay. Before the entrenchments, say, the Germans used their last bit of offensive steam on taking Moscow and holding it while doing the defensive actions in 5, as well as absolutely required minor offensive consolidating line and damage non-bait weekend divisions on the front. I don't entirely get that. Okay. Here are some of the assumed implications of my knowledge. Japanese would attack the Soviets as they made a deal with the Germans to attack the Soviets if they took Moscow by the NKVD, except this deal notified. I don't know the details of what the Japanese promised and who promised to attack the Germans. I'm not doubting that, and I know there was communication going back and forth, but I'm picturing his face. The main primary Japanese ambassador to Germany, or minister or whatever, that was doing a lot of the stuff there. I'm picturing his face. He very well could have, but I don't know if Tojo and the Japanese High Command take that seriously. And so I don't know that they would have. I think the idea is, if it looks like it's completely collapsing, yes, the Japanese would like to scoop up the territory east of Lake Baikal. I really don't think they want to move further west, just because of logistics and other reasons. Okay, I know there's another part here. By extension, that would make Japanese be busy. Their individual naval officers looking to Pearl Harbor, tied down to with the Red Army in Siberia, and the Soviet Pacific Fleet, to even bother provoking U.S. into the war. Also, okay. See, this is the thing. I don't know that there's a myth, and people are, and it was encouraged by the Soviets. So it's not that historians have gotten things wrong and that they are just too lazy or whatever, but it's access to information. The T-34s that rush out and attack the counteroffensive of the 41 to 42 winter, the immediate winter after Barbarossa starts, are not forces moved from the Far East. To the best of my understanding and understanding of historians nowadays, is more and more get access. Some of it's now, some of it's there, it's just in, who reads Russian. Some of it is Westerners don't have access to it. It's still, locked up information, which had been all locked up during the continuation of the Soviet Union. It's Zhukov. Marshal Gregory Zhukov is transferred from the Far East and leads the offensive. These forces were kept and were training up east of Moscow, west of the Urals, as far as I understand. Give you a general area. I don't have better information than that right offhand. So all the forces that were still out there that had fought and defeated the Japanese in 1936 at Khalkhin Gol and other sort of border skirmishes and undeclared war are still all out there, to as far as I know. You can see them being used when they invade Manchukuo and push all the way down into Korea. You have to retreat back a bit due to diplomacy when the Americans agree to splitting up occupation of Korea. The Soviets wanted to split up occupation of Japan like they did in Germany and Austria, though they get the Soviets out of the Austrian occupation, so Austria is not long-term in different administration zones. But part of that deal was to keep Austria separate from Germany and keep Austria out of NATO and other sort of things. NATO hadn't existed yet, but it was basically both the East and the West were going to withdraw from Austria and not have American forces, continued occupying Austria like American and British and French forces occupying Western Germany. That becomes West Germany. Those forces are still there. Japan's running out of oil. The fleet has enough oil for war, not for very long, and it's not giving it over to the army. Won't give it over to the army. Refuses to give it over to the army. There's nearly a civil war going on at some point between the army and the navy, literally. I'm not talking figuratively, I'm talking literally. Nearly, not actually, but nearly. I mean, there are shots fired at a couple of times, but so it's the army that pushes the navy. The army begs the navy, what is it going to take to have you go attack not just America but Britain, because Britain is becoming the Dutch are still administering the Dutch East Indies where the oil is, but they're sort of a puppet, if you will, of the British. And there's some British battleships hanging around out there. The British are militarily building up in the Far East. At the time the offensive is launched, they've just moved there, or they were in the process of moving, but it gets there before the fall of Singapore. Another Anzac division has moved into Singapore. So they're building up. They're getting ready for, got to watch the Japanese thing while they're still fighting alone. Well, I mean, they're able to do some of this because, Germany has invaded the Soviet Union. But so they're building up defenses in the Far East from Japan. So what does it take? And they're trying to how to get the Navy to go to war. And Yamamoto is the leading sort of military tactician and admiral, but he's not in charge of the Navy. I forget who, but there's sort of a clique of old admirals that are really running the Navy. It's just sort of he's the golden boy of tactics, but he's not in charge of it. Japan is a very hierarchical society, still is, but it is also very much on age, seniority, and secondarily, or it can be, if it doesn't quite correspond, seniority in how do I want to say this? Seniority in profession, if you will. Meaning if you are the you've been the blacksmith longer than anybody else in the in your village of blacksmiths or whatever. You're the one in charge, even if there's a couple of guys that are a few years older than you, but they started, you know, in doing that job 5 years after you started or whatever. They're very hierarchical in that, and not performance based. They're not a meritocracy. It's only with the failure of the senior, either in age or in profession, is shown to fail, and then of course once they are shown to fail, they resign or whatever from the profession and go into retirement. And so it's not that they are expected to be the most brilliant or have all the right answers. They're supposed to recognize what the right answers are. So when the golden boy, Yamamoto or whatever, comes up with a great plan, they go, yeah, we're going to go with that plan because it's such a good plan. Not that they're brilliant. It's just they're expected to, but they're the ones that are going to decide what plans end up being used. And so until they're shown to have failed, they're in charge. So and Yamamoto is he's lived in America. He has literally traveled back and forth across America. He's gone to school in America. He was known as a very good poker player in America. He has seen Texas. He has seen at least one or more automotive factories in like Detroit or wherever. He understands the immensity of America and its production, and knows for sure that any war with America, Japan's going to lose. And he is so much against going to war with Japan, the Army puts out arrest orders for him. And for a considerable amount of time, he has to live aboard his battleship, because if he goes off his battleship or at least leaves the base, the Army will arrest him. And there are troops, maybe hidden in buildings or whatever, but are poised outside of wherever they think he is. If the ship sails to another base or they get word that he's somewhere else, gets out, they want to arrest him because he is one of the ones that are talking actively within the hierarchy. Don't go to war with America. Whatever you do, don't go to war with America. Now, once it's decided they're going to war with America, well, he's going to do the best he can to have the best outcome. And he knows that as soon as he hears about that they hadn't clearly declared war with America, he knows, okay, we've lost. I mean, he knows it at that point. Literally, he knows it. Within a day or two at Pearl Harbor, he knows they've lost. There is no possible way of winning. But he, does his duty and goes on. So it's the Army who's running out of oil to continue its war in China, because they want to end the war in China. China will not negotiate a surrender. A ceasefire or a peace, not a surrender, because they're not trying to get all of China. China will not negotiate, for sure, not give up any additional territories, and maybe, I know there's at least some demands for it, but maybe even demanding they withdraw out of Manchuria. Please note, I do sometimes refer to it as Manchuria and sometimes as Manchukuo, or any of the, sometimes Russians or Soviets, and those are all calculated references. And so the Chinese won't settle for some sort of peace. And the Army's running out of oil. So going to war with the Soviets isn't going to get them any oil. Okay, so even if you go, oh, hey, yeah, we got Vladivostok and some more minerals, because there are some more minerals up in the north there that they could access at that point, and some more territory to maybe put some Japanese colonists, and we're more secure because we now have all of Sakhalin Island, and we now have, occupying all the way up to Lake Baikal and whatnot, and so there's no longer the threat from Russia. We've avenged ourselves a second time for the Russo-Japanese War that we won the first time, and yeah, sure, they'd love that, the Army would, but it doesn't achieve their goal of getting oil. They're running out of oil. It is cut off by America and Britain, because Britain tells the Dutch don't sell to the Japanese. and so oil doesn't go. So it still gets, it doesn't solve the Japanese army's problem of no oil. The bribe that the army gives to the Navy is steel. They promise and do deliver a higher quota on, because the steel is coming from Manchukuo mostly, or a lot of it, or at least the iron ore is. And there are steel mills in Manchukuo, but some of it I think is brought back to Japan and turned into steel in Japan. But it's controlled, that element of production is controlled ultimately by the army. And the Navy wants to build some more battleships and some more carriers. And it can't, it's actually, they're sort of sitting around there with workers not working because there's no steel to build them with. And hey, we'll increase your allocation of steel, which takes it away from the needs of the army, because the army needs more artillery shells, needs more artillery pieces, needs more tanks, needs more rifles than it has, which all these things need steel. So it will allocate more to the Navy if the Navy will go to war with the U.S., because you can't go to war with anybody unless the Navy agrees, even in China, because the Navy has to, send the boats back and forth, kind of thing. And they control enough of them. Yes, the Japanese army does eventually build submarines. Crazy as it may sound. Now, they're smallish submarines, they're crude submarines, and their only real purpose is to deliver supplies to Japanese army garrisons stuck out on islands, because the Navy can't supply them with ships. So they build submarines, not to go sink anything. They don't even have torpedoes on them or guns. They're just delivery boats. Okay. So yeah, they're not going to go into Russia unless it truly looks to be a complete and total collapse of Russia. It's got to look as juicy to the Japanese as France looked to Mussolini when he declared war against France, just about the time that the Germans are approaching Paris and realizing that the war is almost over. Now, I don't know that changes much for the Russians. Soviets would lose their military, all-weather airports for hundreds of kilometers ocean. Not entirely okay. These kinds of airports constructed. Yeah, I don't know about airports, how much. The Luftwaffe flew in the winter at airports that they hastily constructed. I don't know how much that matters. I honestly just don't know. I'm not saying it doesn't, I'm just saying I don't know. The Soviets would also, most importantly of all, lose their central railway hub of Moscow. Absolutely, that is a critical element, meaning yes, that's very, very much, because if you lose the Moscow hub and the sort of greater Moscow ring, it may take a train twice as long as to go somewhere. So that means, it's very, very much affects how effectively resources are moved to factories, parts are moved between factories for assembly, how it affects move, finished items, artillery pieces, rifles, tanks, from factories to frontline type units, move supplies, to feed the frontline units, food, ammo, and how effectively you can shift a unit from the northern sector to the southern sector or whatever around. And without that strategic mobility, you gum up the works a lot more. So if you can effectively control Moscow, not just it's control Moscow, I think you put you put Russia into a place of being on the defensive and continually on the defensive. But I think without control of the Mediterranean, because especially if you get Spain in it, because I still think there's going to be needing to have a large amount of German forces sitting in the east. So if you get Spain in the war, you've got to send a lot of German forces to hold in Spain, or the Americans are going to win in Spain. If you don't have Spain in the war, you're still going to lose because they didn't put enough effort early enough. They should have focused on the Mediterranean in 41, not Barbarossa. Do Barbarossa in 42. I know there's arguments why Soviets were recovering from the collapse of the high command in the Winter War, and they were reorganizing up their forces, and by 42 they would have been stronger. Yeah, true. But if you had truly turned, preferably without Spain coming in the war, turned the Mediterranean into an axis or an Italian lake, truly stationed forces in Morocco, and totally cleared out, not just Egypt, but Palestine, Syria, maybe pushed into Iraq, clear that whole thing out and have, German forces sitting on the periphery of that with a reserve that could navally be moved to wherever, if the main attack is, pushing north out of Sudan, or if they start sending, an American invasion to Morocco, move a large, army around, not just a corps. Face it all off, yeah, that would have been better. And then, because you could theoretically, whether you do it or not, come through Persia, you would have a better situation with the German army. The German army would have been more prepared, in my opinion. They thought the war was over, and they thought the war with the Soviet Union was going to come, but that was going to be the next war, whatever that meant, whether there was going to be an official peace with Britain or not in between, but enough time to re-equip the army, not use the army, with Panzer I's and Panzer II's in the main Panzer battalions. Those become auxiliary tanks of one sort or another, and equip the army with, proper Panzer III's with the long barrels, and proper Panzer IV's, and, enough of them, and do all that stuff that they could have done in a more, without consuming up large numbers of them on the Eastern Front, and just consuming up some on the fringes. Could have done that better and could have been more effective, and Russia still would have been handicapped by a lot of factors, including the lack of radios, including the continued control of the NKVD or the commissars, whatever you want to say. Those are, I think, slightly different organizations, and commanders afraid to retreat or afraid to attack, just afraid. And so Germany very well might have been able to plunge in better. And Italy might have been able to make a bigger contribution to the war at that point. But without controlling the Mediterranean, you're going to lose eventually. Basically, what I want you to tell me is what would most realistically occur of all these. I think I've sort of gone over all of them, sort of individually. Thank you for your time. Of course, this is what I do. Apologies. Okay, I don't worry about grammar or, well, your English here is just fine. I understood most of it. So I guess that's sort of, if Germany can do two things. One, secure a situation in the East that it doesn't have to have 2/3 of its army holding down that situation. Whether that army is just sitting there because they're looking over at a Soviet army that looks dangerous, and both are sort of waving at each other, seeing who's going to, if there's some sort of a peace, if there's a ceasefire, but you still have to keep 2/3 of your army over there, well, that's better than fighting a war because it isn't consuming munitions, men aren't dying, all that stuff. But that ties up most of your personnel. If you can get it down to like 20-25% of your army is just sort of guarding the frontier, and you can secure the Mediterranean, then you can probably have a situation in which, even though the Americans are able to outproduce you, you can shift enough of your forces around to an invasion to keep them from plunging deep in. The Germans were quite capable of stopping a D-Day invasion if they had the reserves. But remember, the day before D-Day, the Americans enter Rome. They can't hold Rome because they don't have any forces to send down to continue to hold. And very smartly, Kesselring is falling back to, once, talked about the defensive situation on the Eastern Front. If you continue to pour forces to hold at a particular point, you're just sending more people to the meat grinder stupidly. Man, since the Italian peninsula, to a man on foot is quite wide, but compared to the, Eastern Front, or even compared to France, is a very narrow frontage. So once you realize that your position is being turned, you can't hold it. It's better to fall back to another prepared position and fall back to another one and fall back to another one. I recently got, a graphic image of a poster that was, or a flyer, I should say, that was made just somewhat prior to, I think, the Anzio invasion, that it was, that the Germans made, and it showed the progress that the American or the Allies were going to make in Italy, and as the Germans fall back, and trying to get them to be discouraged and not want to fight, and it showed the sort of final northernmost bit they're going to get to in 1947. So even in 1943, early 44. Late 43 or early 44, whenever this was document was made, the Germans had already gotten the understanding that they are simply falling back in Italy, and it wasn't going to be a situation of, and they're giving this out to the enemy, wasn't going to be a situation that they're going to be pushed out of Italy. It's just you're going to be dying for the next 4 years or whatever, depending on whenever this was promoted, put out there, as you slowly push up the Italian peninsula. And, is it worth dying to, for another yard of Italian territory or whatever? So even the Germans were realizing that they aren't going to hold Italy. And it's just going to be a falling back. So if you can't hold Italy, because the Americans are able to put in too much forces there, you don't have good reinforcements. You don't have, part of it is just literally the supplies. If you have 10 artillery pieces and the Allies have 10 artillery pieces, and you have 20 rounds for each artillery piece, and the Americans have 200 rounds for artillery, it isn't an equal match. It isn't 10 versus 10. It's 20 versus 200 is what it, per gun. And so the Germans can be if they can effectively put it on the target, but the Americans miss the target 10 times for every time they hit in comparison, and still do as much damage as to the Germans as if the Germans every round was hitting the enemy. And so the Germans do not have the logistical capability. But if they had that reserve and that production to move it to, Normandy and supply it well enough and move enough of it there, now they would have bottled up. The beachhead. So, but you could make it too costly. But well, a lot of what ifs. Very good, Nick Gould. Thanks for the long post. I hope this video qualifies as an answer. I'm gonna reply making a video or something, but hope you all found this interesting. Like, share, subscribe. You can even support my Patreon if you wish, but I just really like, share, subscribe, and comment is what I really ask. So thanks everyone. See you next time for more talks on history or whatever. Thanks.